Welcome to the Own It Powercast, the place to be when you get serious about making big changes and accelerating growth in your life and in your relationships. Finally create the life you've always wanted, living life on your own terms. Learn how to take your fear and turn it into powerful choices that will create sustained change. Now your host, Mary Baker.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Own It Powercast, the place to come to get what you need to move yourself forward. Hey, it's Mary Baker, and welcome to episode 311, Boundaries and Reality, Letting Go of Fantasy, Facing What's True. Well, welcome back to this month, which has been, as you know, all about boundaries, and how learning boundaries isn't just about saying no, it's about unlearning a lot of things. You know, people talk about boundaries like they're just a script or a phrase like, oh, just say no, just detach, just accept it. But here's the truth. Boundaries are a lot of emotional work, like real emotional work. And I think until we normalize that, and I try to do that for clients all the time, but I think people will keep feeling like failures, especially when this stuff feels heavy, it feels painful, and oftentimes, especially in the beginning of the work, disorienting. Because clients say all the time when they start working on boundaries, they feel a lot of upheaval and everything's changing because it is. Boundaries aren't just relational tools. I think they're reality tools. I think they bring us back to what is instead of what we wish was true. And that shift from fantasy to clarity asks us to walk through three things most people are terrified of, and very similar to the three-legged stool I talk about, and that's grief, acceptance, and detachment. So today we're going to dive into why boundaries force us to face reality in a good way, what that feels like in our bodies, why that can really hurt before it heals, and how you know you're finally seeing things clearly instead of protecting an illusion. So here's the part we rarely talk about. And I think it's really important because I think the more you understand about boundary work, the easier it's going to be for you. So before boundaries bring all the lovely peace that they really do bring, they bring clarity. And clarity is often painful at first. I would say probably always painful at first, because without boundaries, we created entire stories to protect ourselves. And as you're listening today, you may be anywhere on this continuum. Resistance may come up. You may even have a little bit of resentment that I'm even talking about this, and that's normal, and that's okay. So some of the stories we create are, oh, they're just stressed, or they didn't mean it, or it'll change when the timing's better, when this changes, when that gets better, fill in the blank, or I just need to be more patient. These aren't lies, and we've talked about this recently on the show. They're really survival strategies because they're the stories we create to soften the blow. They're that what I call the emotional bubble wrap we wrap around ourselves so we don't have to feel the full sting of disappointment, the god-awful betrayal, or just reality. So we tell ourselves these things because they helped us cope at a time, usually early in life, when facing that truth felt too big, too threatening, or too destabilizing. And that's how you perfect that coping strategy is early on in life. Because back then they protected you when you didn't have the skills, the support, or the emotional safety to deal with what was really happening. And you may not have had that recently in your life again. Because when we struggle with boundaries, we usually put ourselves in less than healthy situations. But we use these to postpone the grief, to delay the heartbreak of seeing someone clearly. And a lot of times you can find yourself in that space, like you know the deal, but you also know you're not ready to face it. But we use them also so we don't have to name the truth aloud, because once it's spoken, we can't unknow it. And naming that truth forces a decision, doesn't it? It's going to force a shift. Ideally, It forces us to reckon with what we've tolerated, maybe what we hoped for that wasn't coming true, and a lot of what we've been avoiding. So we hang on to that softer story. We cling to that, oh, maybe, or the someday, or they didn't mean it. Because let's face it, that version of reality feels a hell of a lot safer. It keeps the relationship intact, it keeps your fantasy alive, and it keeps your heart protected just enough to get through the day. But here's the problem. Survival strategies aren't meant to be long-term housing. What saved you back then can actually keep you stuck now. And boundaries, real boundaries, are going to call you out of that old familiar shelter, and they're going to call you into the open air of truth. And I know this is really uncomfortable. It's raw. But it's also that amazing moment that you stop surviving and start living. Because boundaries say, let's look at what's actually happening. Not what they promise and don't deliver on. Not what you hope for, but isn't based in reality. Not what used to be, but rather what's real right now. So for example, let's say someone keeps apologizing but never changes their behavior. Well, without boundaries, you're going to tell yourself in some way, shape, or form, it's okay, they're trying. With boundaries, you finally see and probably have to admit to yourself over time that, guess what? They're trying to keep me around. They're not trying to grow. And maybe I have to accept that they don't want to and may never. And that's the emotional maturity part, being able to pause long enough to see what's actually in front of you. I think it's learning to tell the difference between effort and intention. And because effort is someone doing just enough to keep you hopeful, breadcrumbing, right? Intention is someone doing enough to actually grow. Like they're all in. They know why they're doing this. And it isn't about you anymore. It's because they want to become that person. So I think it's seeing that difference between potential and pattern. Potential is who they could be on their best day or in your best imagination or when you first got together. Pattern, though, is who they consistently choose to be. Consistently. Not perfectly, but over time on average. Look, words are easy. Consistency is not. You know that from your own work. I know it from mine. Change is not easy. Showing up differently over time is not. That is a wholehearted choice that we have to commit to. And this is exactly why I think boundaries can feel so destabilizing, because they pull you out of that emotional fantasy you've been holding on to. And they drop you right into that truth you've been avoiding. And that can be a hard fall. Because you know once you see what's real, you can't unsee it. You may try, you may backpedal it, but you can't. And truth, I think by its very nature, demands that next step of us, doesn't it? It asks you to decide, okay, what are you going to do with what you know now? Now that you can't play the fantasy anymore. Because truth demands that next step. It doesn't sit quietly once you've seen it. It's going to start to tug at you. It is going to whisper in the back of your mind at 2 a.m. It's going to show up in your body as tension, irritation, or that heaviness you can't shake. And I also think it can show up in ways that we leak it out around things we're not really upset about. And we're prickly and irritable. We're not open, certainly not feeling grounded and confident. I think a lot of this can be that internal fight that I talk about all the time. Like half of you knows damn well you've got to face this and the other half is terrified. And wouldn't that make sense? Of course you're terrified. If you weren't terrified, you wouldn't even need to be listening to this today. You'd already be doing it. But that truth wants movement. And I think it really wants alignment. I think we want alignment. It wants you to stop living in that gap between what you know and what you're still pretending. And this is where I think boundaries start to become very real, because once you see the truth, You can't go back to that old dynamic without feeling the cost of it. And that's what is important. And that's what part of the pain is, I mentioned earlier. That cost to your peace, that cost to your self-respect, and ultimately the cost to your nervous system and your health. Because you're going to feel it in your gut, in your subconscious, when you say yes, but you really mean no. You feel it in your chest when someone crosses a line you've been too afraid to hold. You feel it in your exhaustion when you carry what was never yours. Truth demands action from us, even if it's small, even if it's shaky, and that's where I recommend you start. Even if it's that little boundary you whisper instead of announce. Even if it's, gosh, I wish I would have stood up to that person, and you tell your friend about it. That's okay. It's part of the process. That's how you build that muscle. Truth is going to ask you some hard but loving questions. It's going to say, okay, now that you see clearly, how are you going to take care of yourself? What will you stop pretending? And what would that mean? What reality are you ready to accept, even if it hurts? Because there's going to be collateral damage. And I think this is where the emotional work really begins. The work on detachment and grief and acceptance. That part that is messy and isn't glamorous by any stretch. But that is the absolutely transformational piece. Because once you let truth lead, reality lead, boundaries stop being something you force because they become something you naturally begin to live over time. So let's talk about detachment again. I got to talk about it all the time. It takes a while to get our head wrapped around it. So it's not just you. It took me a long time to learn detachment, even after I knew what it was. So when I say detachment, it's loving detachment. It's caring without carrying. It doesn't mean you stop caring. It just means you take your hands off stuff that aren't yours. And you stop carrying their consequences, but also your own. For example, maybe your brother overspends and runs out of money every month. And in the past, you would bail him out so he could avoid that fallout. But loving detachment sounds like, I am so sorry you're really struggling. I can't send money, but I know you'll figure this out. This way, you're no longer shielding them from the results of their choices, but in reality, you're no longer shielding yourself, are you? And then you have to sit with your fears and feelings around all the unearned guilt of poor them. Now what are they going to do and all the things? And that's why detaching from someone's choices is the key mantra you have to keep telling yourself. That your brother had choices. He's had choices and he's been choosing. Because trust me, if you weren't bailing him out, he'd be making some choices right now. But you also stop carrying their emotions. So let's say maybe your partner gets really disappointed or irritated when you set a boundary. Of course, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? In the past, you would probably rush to fix their feelings, over-explain, backpedal, change it, whatever, so that you didn't feel guilty. But detachment sounds like, I hear that you're upset. I get it. I understand. And my boundary still stands. And their emotional wave, all their process, all their fill in the blank is not your storm to manage. That's for them to go kicking and screaming to acceptance. The same work that you're doing. Did you notice that? And you also work on not carrying their reactions anymore. So let's say a friend gets really annoyed or probably passive aggressive because you said no to that last minute favor they always do. Well, old you would probably over-explain, apologize, backtrack. But detached you says, hey, I get that you're frustrated. I'm still not available. And you don't twist yourself into knots. You don't contort yourself to change how they react. That's manipulation, guys. That's manipulative. That's you trying to manage them and the outcome. That is manipulation. And the other piece we don't talk about enough is you also stop carrying their resistance. Like, let's say your adult child resists every suggestion, refuses support, fights all the feedback. Well, maybe for you, instead of pushing and convincing or lecturing, you say something like, you know what? I have to accept that you get to choose what you do. And I'm here if you truly want help, but only if you ask me. I don't want to insert myself anymore. Their resistance, just like yours, belongs to them. It's not a challenge you must overcome. And I want you to think about, if you struggle with this, boy, who modeled that for me? Did I grow up with people who did not care about my boundaries, told me what I should want, think, and need, and do? You also stop carrying their avoidance. So let's say a coworker keeps procrastinating on the shared tasks with you and just kind of expects you to pick up that slack. When in the past, maybe you would just step in to keep the peace and prevent a mess. Well, detachment is brave, and it sounds like, you know what? I'm not going to be able to complete your portion of the project. And if it isn't done, we're going to need to explain that to the supervisor together. You see all the boundaries in there? The boundary is we're going to go to the supervisor. I'm not covering for you anymore. I'm not covering your avoidance with my over-functioning. We could do a whole show just on that right there. And finally, you stop carrying their work, their process, because you certainly don't want someone all up in yours. So let's say, for example, your mom refuses to go to therapy, but wants to keep emotionally dumping on you. Probably calling you, complaining about your father or your sister or her sister or whatever. But you stop trying to be her counselor, and instead you say, you know, Mom, I really care about you. Yet these are things a therapist can really help with, so I'm not doing this anymore. And you can return that emotional labor back to where it belongs. I love you, I'm here, but I'm not going to lose myself to be here anymore. You don't do it in a lashing out way. You got to make sure you're calm and grounded, and you are settled into the reality, because parallel process, what we need them to do, we got to do as well. The problem is that most of us learn the opposite. We learn that love equals responsibility for other people's emotions. Maybe we learn that caring means absorbing certain things, and not absorbing is uncaring and selfish and all this stuff. We learned that closeness means merging. So when we begin detaching, boy, it feels like abandonment, doesn't it? But the truth is, it's actually the first time we're actually loving someone cleanly. That's how I describe it to clients, cleanly, without rescuing, without enabling, without controlling the outcome. I was talking to a client the other day about this. You know the old phrase, you can't rescue your partner and not resent the hell out of them or respect them eventually. You can't. No one can. Let's say your partner's chronically defensive. And historically, of course, you've tiptoed around their feelings, buffered the truth, softened your needs without even realizing you're doing that. But then you work on yourself, and detachment sounds like, you know what? I'm not going to argue with you, and I'm not going to shrink. I will share my truth calmly, but what you do with that truth is totally up to you. Or maybe you have a child that's learning hard lessons. Well, don't worry, detachment doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you are growing a grown-up and you care about what is best for them 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So you say, I am here to support you, but I cannot live your life for you. Or conversely, maybe you have a parent who keeps crossing the boundaries. And detachment looks like, hey, I love you and I'm protecting my peace. Detachment is not disconnection, except for disconnecting from the outcome. It's not disconnecting from them per se. It's just that beginning of truth. And I think it's where the emotional responsibility and all the choices finally fall back into their right places. So we can't talk about this without talking about the grief aspect, and acceptance always requires grief. My personal opinion is you can't have acceptance without walking through some kind of kicking and screaming process. And of course, it is the heaviest part of boundary work. Because to accept reality, you must grieve that fantasy. You got to start to grieve the illusion and to grieve the old hope that you keep hanging on to. And I don't think you're going to do that without some love and support around you, which is why I keep talking about the course here on the show, because of the group component. You know, not a huge group, an intimate group that is safe, comfortable, supportive, kind, understanding, and something to lean on. Because if we're going to let go, we got to have somebody and something to hold on to that's good for us. You might be grieving the version of someone you desperately wanted them to be. I'm sure that feels very familiar for a lot of you. Maybe you're grieving the childhood you never had. That apology that'll never come. The relationship you tried so hard to save, which probably included the dream that depended on someone else changing. And boy, when you get to the other side of this work, all this grief comes up in a good way, because then you start grieving all that time you spent carrying other people's stuff and not taking care of yourself. The grief is not indulgent. It's honest. And it's that moment when those blinders come off and reality lands, and it's going to land gently or harshly, but truthfully. And something I think about all the time is you can't heal what you keep pretending isn't there. And acceptance comes, as I've said many times before, I think, my opinion is, as a byproduct of when we let go and we surrender and we stop fighting. It comes at the end of the grief process, and it comes on its own accord. Any kind of forced acceptance is not genuine, I don't think. Don't let anyone ever tell you you just need to forgive or you just need to accept. You need to possibly be willing to show up for that process of kicking and screaming to acceptance. And maybe some forgiveness and peace comes of that, but you can't force that, and no one should force that upon you. Acceptance isn't passive either. It's not giving up. A lot of people think it's giving up. It's really saying, guess what? This is what's real, and I'll choose how to move forward, not staying stuck in what I wish would happen. I also think it is that doorway to emotional adulthood. It's why I always say, if you do nothing else in the work, learn how to grieve. And it's also, ironically, that moment when you take your power back. I know that may not make sense at first, but it will eventually. And what I mean by that is, like, someone you love keeps choosing avoidance, keeps choosing that chaos, keeps choosing moments of connection over the work of growth. And what you eventually come to acceptance around is, you know, they're not bad people, they're just not able. And maybe this won't work for me, and I got to make some big changes, and that's awful, and it's hard. But at least it lets you let them go in that regard without sacrificing yourself. So here's another part that people rarely talk about. You know, once you start seeing reality clearly, the feeling you have often is sadness, not empowerment. It may not even be anger. It may not be clarity. It might be sadness, because guess what? Truth will cost you something. But right behind that sadness is going to be a deep, steady peace. The kind, what I mean by that is the kind that doesn't depend on someone's reaction, their choices, or their emotional weather. But it can be a real mixed bag. So I'm just trying to normalize some of this for you. Seeing reality can end up feeling like relief, a lot of grieving, like we just talked about. Ironically, some calm. Oh, some anger. Clarity. like you are actually awake now. Exposure, you're going to feel very vulnerable. You're going to feel liberated. You're going to feel sad. And you're going to feel like you actually have some personal power. So it's really complex because you're shedding all these old survival strategies and you're meeting yourself and I think the world in such a new way. And I think the gift in this is that once you see reality, you can finally make choices from a grounded place, which in turn, I think creates more self-trust and self-confidence and more groundedness. And your boundaries aren't reactions anymore. They're going to be your choices, and they're going to be rooted in a lot more clarity, a lot more truth, and a lot more alignment. And that is where the freedom is. And that's why the course I designed has all of these pieces in it, because I know all the pieces that we need in order to do this work, along with boundaries. So remember, you can grieve and still choose peace. You can detach and still love someone. In fact, you're going to love them more cleanly and better. And that this is the heart of boundary work. It's just learning slowly over time to come to acceptance around the truth, to metabolize that, and really look at your fantasies. And if this episode stirred up a lot for you, you're right where you need to be. If you need support around this, reach out. I'm here. The group is here. Because this is that sacred middle of growth, I call it. It's really messy, it's really tender, it's really honest, and you need people to support you. But remember, it's also that bridge into that life that you really want, where your peace no longer depends on someone else changing. So today we talked about how boundaries pull us out of that denial and back into reality by requiring some uncomfortable but essential steps called grief and acceptance and detachment. And we talked about why, facing what's real can be really painful, but it's also the beginning of freedom. We looked at ways that we can rescue and carry other people's stuff and what it means to let go and how that is the basis of really good self-esteem. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Be sure to pass this along to anyone you think that could be helped by learning a little bit more about boundaries. Boundaries is a huge concept we could talk about all year and not be done. And if you're working on boundaries, be so proud of yourself. It is a process. It's going to take you a minute. It's going to be 3 forward, 2 back. Sometimes it's going to be hard. Sometimes it's going to feel fabulous. Just be glad you're doing it because you're making your life better. Make sure you check out the show notes. That's where I have all the information of the courses that I offer and how to work with me. If you have any questions or concerns, reach out. All right, so pay it forward. Keep focusing on you, and I'll see you next time.
We hope you took away some useful insights and tools you could begin using right away. If you did, please leave a positive review and share on your social media. Because could you imagine if everyone in your life really got it together? Remember, own it now, so you can really own it later.